So when we're thinking about the political crisis of the 1850s, what we need to do is actually look much earlier than that. We can actually look back to the earliest portion of westward expansion when we think about the Louisiana Territory being purchased in 1803. And as that territory began to form into states, this is where we begin to see slavery become an issue. And so in 1819, when Missouri is petitioning to become a state, we see that this becomes a much greater problem as states start to jockey for power. And the biggest problem is that within Congress itself, we see that northern congressmen are fearful of the slave majority in the South and how this kind of slave power is going to continue to grow as southern states gain more power in the legislature. And the same thing for the South. They fear a growing northern industrial sector. And so finally in 1820, when the Missouri Compromise is finally reached, after Missouri had petitioned to become not only a state, but specifically a slave state, we see that the 36-degree 30-minute line is instituted. And so this latitude would be basically a divider for the nation. Those areas in the Louisiana Territory below the 36-degree 30-minute line would allow slavery for expansion into those areas. And then above that line, slavery would be prohibited. And this seems like it would work for a while until 1848 at the end of the Mexican War, when after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States gains quite a bit of territory in the American Southwest as well as California. And so the question then arises, do we extend the 36-degree 30-minute line all the way to the Pacific? Or do we come up with another policy, such as popular sovereignty, where states or territories decide whether or not for themselves they will have slavery in those areas? This is when we begin to see more of a political issue arising. Now add on top of that, that Northern abolitionists have also been trying to make this a moral issue. It becomes very complicated. And so around 1850 we see the political debates heating up, and finally we see with California being admitted into the Union with a compromise of 1850, as well as some provisions for popular sovereignty and other issues regarding slavery within Washington, D.C., finally, we see a little bit of headway being made, but it's not enough to stave off political crisis or civil war. Throughout the 1850s, the crisis continues to grow, and eventually with bleeding Kansas towards 1854, when Kansas-Nebraska, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed in 1854, finally we see that the Missouri Compromise is repealed. Those two territories would be allowed to decide, based on popular sovereignty, whether or not slavery would exist. But what really ends up happening in 1854 and 55 is basically a civil war within those territories, as slaveholders attempt to throw the legislature and try to create more of a slave power out there. So by the late 1850s, when the Republican Party is on the rise and Abraham Lincoln comes to the forefront of that party, their platform is centered around prohibiting the expansion of slavery. And with prohibiting the expansion of slavery, Lincoln is not outright trying to outlaw slavery in the states where it already exists, but is simply trying to keep it from spreading. The South, however, is growing more and more afraid of the possibility that he could eventually look to the southern states and attempt to regulate what they consider to be property rights in those areas. And so by the time the 1860 election rolls around, we know that many southern leaders are debating secession. And Joseph Mumford Foy here at Poplar Grove writes to his son about the possibility of secession happening. And he laments this fact, but many leaders viewed it to be inevitable. And once 1860 came about and Lincoln was elected, even though he never received a single vote from the South, we see eventually North Carolina and other southern states seceding from the Union.